If you've ever looked at a house, you've probably said to yourself, you know, that house is more than just a house. It's made of smaller things. And if I look at the way the smaller things are arranged in building the house, well, they show up in these different specific, what we might call levels of organization. The house really is nothing more than a collection of individual rooms. Now, a bunch of rooms by themselves aren't a house, but if I take and put them all together, wow, I have a house. If I look closer at one of the rooms, well, really, it's nothing more than a bunch of walls and ceilings and a floor. Now, if I look at walls and a ceiling and a floor just all by themselves, they're nothing. But if I put them together in a very particular way, oh, I have a room. When we look at our bodies, or really any biological organism, we notice that we're put together in a very similar way. There are different levels of organization um, that we're designed around, we're built on, and these levels of organization all start with the atom. Or if I was to take and mush you up into the simplest thing that you're made of, it is our atoms. Carbon atoms, hydrogen atoms, oxygen atoms, nitrogen atoms. These atoms aren't just floating around all willy-nilly. They're put together in particular ways to build you, but the simplest level of organization is the atom, like this carbon atom that we see on the screen. Now, if I take this carbon atom and throw in four hydrogen atoms and link them together through chemical bonds, boom, I've made a jump. I'm not just carbon and hydrogen atoms anymore. Now I'm a molecule. Not a very complicated molecule, but I'm a molecule. One carbon and four hydrogens hooked together. Or if I took one oxygen and hooked two hydrogens to it, boom, I've made water. Again, I'm not a very complicated molecule, but I've made a big jump. I'm not just individual atoms, I'm small or simple molecules. I could step it up a notch and instead of linking, a few hydrogens to the carbon, I could link a bunch of carbons to other carbons and throw some hydrogens and other things on. And now I'm still at the same level. I'm still at the molecular level of organization. I haven't changed that much. But because I'm so big, let's call me a macromolecule. And as we get to this level of organization, boy, it gets hard to draw a bunch of individual atoms. Let's replace those drawings with, well, symbols. C for carbon, H for hydrogen, and the little blue lines represent the chemical bonds that hold them together. This macromolecule is big. If I zoom out, it's this huge chain of carbons and hydrogen, and well, it usually looks something more like this. Here we have an example of a macromolecule, specifically a phospholipid. And just to keep things in perspective, there's that carbon atom that this macromolecule is basically built on a backbone of. There's that water molecule. The macromolecule is huge and much more complicated than either the atom or the small simple molecule. And when we get to the macromolecule level, it gets hard to draw all those carbons and hydrogens and oxygens and put them all in the right place with the lines. You know what? Let's use a picture. Cartoons really do a good job at representing things at these more complicated levels of organization. So I drew a picture of a phospholipid on a screen, and usually I don't find it hanging around all by itself. Generally, phospholipids are found with other phospholipids making specific structures. So here I have thousands, hundreds of thousands of individual phospholipids fitting together in a particular way, making up what's essentially going to be the next level of organization. We'll get into the specifics of the structure that we see here a little bit later on, but it's getting complicated again. I'm going to replace that picture with a line, and when I zoom out, I see I've got a cell. All of those macromolecules, and it's not just phospholipids, it's a lot of different macromolecules, but they all fit together in a very particular, very complex way to make this structure called a cell. Now, a couple really important things have happened as we jump from the macromolecule level to the cellular level. Life. This is the first level where we begin to see life. If you're simpler than a cell, it's very difficult to be alive. And there are a lot of arguments whether things simpler than cells can be alive. We can talk about that some other time. But generally speaking, the cell is the level where we first say, this is where life shows up. We go from something that's not living to something that's living. Two, a lot of books, because this jump is so big as far as complexity go, a lot of books will throw in organelles in between the macromolecule and cellular level. It's these structures that we see inside the cell, like mitochondria and rough endoplasmic reticulum. They perform functions inside the cell, but depending on your point of view, they do or don't deserve to be considered an individual level of organization. Sometimes it goes macromolecule, organelle, cell. Sometimes the organelle just kind of gets left out. For simple organism, sometimes one cell is plenty. However, for multicellular organisms like ourselves, one cell isn't going to do it. We're made literally of trillions of cells. And because we're made of trillions of cells, these cells specialize to do different functions in our body. Some cells carry oxygen, like red blood cells. Some cells carry messages, like neurons. Some cells contract, like muscle cells. Some cells contract and make up part of the heart, like this cardiac muscle cell I'm looking at right here. Now, when I look at this one cardiac muscle cell, it usually doesn't work by itself. It usually has a lot of friends. And when I take that cardiac muscle cell and group it with all of these other cardiac muscle cells, or it could be a neuron grouped with other neurons, or it could be a skeletal muscle cell grouped with other skeletal muscle cells. But once I get a group of cells that are basically the same and doing the same thing, I've now jumped a level of organization again. I'm now at the tissue level of organization. A group of the same kind of cell working together. There are 4 primary tissue types: epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. And when I take at least 2 or more of these different tissue types and put them together in a really particular structure like, say, a heart, I've now jumped from the tissue level of organization to the organ level of organization. 2 or more tissues structured together to make something gives you an organ. And then when I take this organ, the heart, and link it with other organs, like blood vessels, I've now jumped again from the organ level to the organ system level. The heart with all the blood vessels make my cardiovascular system. The brain, the spinal cord, and all the peripheral nerves make my nervous system. All the muscles of the body make up my muscular system. My esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, etc. make up the digestive system, and so on and so forth. And when I take all of these organ systems and slap them together, eventually I get to an organism. The pinnacle, the peak of all the complexities that we've been discussing. So just to quickly review, I can take atoms and put them together to make either small molecules, if it's just maybe a couple hydrogens and an oxygen, or if it's lots of individual atoms put together in a really complex way, I've made a macromolecule. I can take lots of macromolecules and put them together to make cells, which that's a big jump in complexity, and it's a big jump in functionality, because cells are where life first shows up. So a lot of times in between the macromolecule and cellular level, we shove the organelle in there. The same kind of cell working together make a tissue. 2 or more tissues working together make an organ. Several organs working together make the organ system. And if I take all 11 organ systems and slap them together, finally I've made an organism.